at the beginning of the pitch, just make it customized to that specific podcast host. Don't just make it cookie cutter. Make sure that you're checking out an episode that the host has done, checking out the show description, because you don't want to just be wasting all your time reaching out to shows that you're not a fit for. So that's super important.
One thing I don't talk about enough is the impact podcasting has had on my professional life and how it opened so many doors for me. So if you want to start a podcast or you want to level up your current one, then you need to work with my podcast strategist, Juliana Barbati. She owns a podcast marketing and production agency, and her team takes care of everything from editing and optimizing to scheduling for you, making this process a breeze for you. She's seriously the best. All her info is in the show notes. You can go to julianabarbati.com and tell her I sent you.
Hi, Trevor. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Super excited to be on the show.
Yay. Well, I would love for you to get started in telling us more about who you are and what you do. Super excited to hear more about your journey with your business.
Yeah. And again, thank you for having me onto the show. I started a company called Podcasting You back in 2017. Back during that time, I was still in college. To preface it a little bit more beyond that, and the reason I started that company is even a few years prior to that, back in 2015, I was running a separate company at the time, and I thought it would be really cool to go out there and start a podcast. And with that, I grew that company to 100,000 Instagram followers within a couple of months. We had a very successful Facebook following, but it was a very motivational based company. And I found it very hard to sell products with that company. It would be like a morning routine course. It would be a mindset course, and it wasn't too profitable of a company. But with that said, because we had grew so fastly on our Instagram and Facebook, I was like, what happens if something comes down and that traffic gets taken away? Our Instagram account gets deleted. So I was like, why not go out there and start a podcast? I've been listening to podcasts myself. That's what really helped me get into the entrepreneurial journey. I remember back in college, I was listening to podcasts in the gym when I was eating lunch, walking to and from classes. So it was even back in 2013, I was listening to podcasts. And then a couple of years later, thought it'd be cool to start my own show and ran that show for about 2 years. I was interviewing different guests on that show, super successful entrepreneurs, but I was the one that was bootstrapping the company. So I was booking all the guests myself. I was writing all the show notes myself, doing all the editing, just using all these skills. And then fast forward 2 years from that, where the launch of Podcasting You in 2017. And again, I was still in college, just wanted to make some extra money on the side and was just freelancing my skills. So I joined Upwork and just started helping people basically do the skills that I had taught myself, which was editing podcasts, writing show notes. And then I kept finding job postings of people wanting to get booked on podcasts. So just continued to work with those folks, continued to get them booked on podcasts. And then I think about a year into the business, I realized maybe I should bring on an employee. This could actually be something. And again, it was just more of a startup, a side hustle. Then 2 years into the business, I was like, this is going good. Maybe I should get a website now. And then fast forward a couple more years. Then after that, we worked with over 400 clients, booked over 6,500 interviews. So it just started as a side hustle and then really just continued to grow. And then really during the pandemic, the podcasting space just took off and it's been a pretty successful company.
Oh my gosh, that's such a fun story and timeline and very encouraging for other entrepreneurs to hear, because oftentimes when we see someone being successful, having those 100,000 followers plus, we're like, oh, it happened overnight. They were just lucky or whatever. And I love that you specifically shared about having that motivational account and realizing this is not making me a whole lot of money. And that's, I think, something that some people don't necessarily understand, that having a huge following and an engaged audience doesn't necessarily mean that you're monetizing it. And when you're looking from the outside in, you don't really know. And then finding an opportunity with your skills to create something for people and being successful at it, that is amazing. Congratulations on all your success.
Thank you.
So who do you specifically serve with Podcasting You? Who are the people that hire you to then find shows for them to be on?
Yeah, most specifically, we work with folks, I say in the investment space. So we work with folks in primarily the real estate space, but then we've been branching out beyond that, where you're looking at your private equity firms, your alternative investment firms. We tried working with folks on Wall Street, more your mutual funds, and I found that a little bit more difficult. We worked with folks in the crypto space, also found those folks to be just a little bit more difficult. But I find that the alternative investment space, it's pretty crazy all the different things that you can invest in. When you're talking outside of real estate, you have your laundromat people. We recently took on a client that invests in laundromats. We have another client where you invest in barrels of whiskey. You can invest in vineyards. It's really crazy all the alternative investments that you can invest in. And that's really what our company specialized in. But it really wasn't always that way. When I started the company back in, again, 2017, we were just taking on any sort of client that we could get our hands on, whether they were a health coach, whether they were a lawyer, whether they were a politician, whether they were a real estate investor or just your standard entrepreneur. And then after like 3 or 4 years, I'm pulling my hair out of every time you take on a new client, we had to drum up a new strategy. I was like, why don't we just focus on one specific niche and then become very successful in that niche? And it was a risk at the time because we only had a handful of real estate clients out of our portfolio. I was like, I love working with folks in the space. I'm interested in investing in real estate myself. Why not bridge that gap and really work with them? So it's been great, been more successful than I imagined. And then I'm also opened my eyes to the real estate space within itself, seeing just all the different areas that you can invest in real estate. It's pretty crazy.
Wow, that's so interesting because that was my curiosity, like why this space? And then in hearing your backstory, I didn't hear you say that you were into that at all. But that's one of the things with business too, is in the beginning, you'll take anyone that will pay you money. You'll accept, and then you start understanding what works best, what you enjoy, right? The people that you enjoy working with. And I think that's the challenge when business coaches are like, you need to niche down. I don't really know what I want at this moment. I just want to make some money. It takes a few years to be like, I want to work with this type of people. They want to work with me. It brings me joy, because that's the other side of it too, is sometimes we end up offering things that we don't really enjoy, but because it's making us money, and then we have to reassess. So that's cool that you found your way, and it's a win-win because you're learning more about the industry too, which is something that you're interested in. Super cool. Well, what are some of your tips now that you've been in the behind the scenes in so many different levels in terms of podcasting for people that want to find shows to be in? Like, what's the best strategy? Because you mentioned that too. Whenever you would get somebody from a different niche, you'd have to come up with a completely different strategy. So what are some of your tips, and really the importance of being on podcasts? I think I don't stress this enough with having a podcast myself, that podcasting is such an amazing way to get more visible. And regardless of how many shows or how many downloads the show has, especially as you're getting started, it's a matter of practice. But you tell me.
I would say, first off, figure out who's your target audience, who's your ideal client, who is going to be listening to you. So as in our example, maybe it's real estate investors, maybe it is those other private equity firms. Let's say you're an entrepreneur and you're selling certain products, you're a certain entrepreneur coach. If you're, say, a health and fitness coach, you want to target health and fitness podcasts. So it's really honing in on who your target audience is. And then from there, it's what value can you provide that podcast host and their audience? You're not just coming onto the podcast to sell. There's always going to be a time on a podcast where the host will ask you about your business. Typically at the end of the show, we'll host ask, like, where can our audience find you? That's the time where you can say, hey, this is where you can learn more about me. So you're not on the podcast to sell, you're really on the podcast to give value. So that's what you really need to know. And when it comes to, one, building out that target audience, and then two, it comes to writing down and creating a pitch. So with that pitch, like I mentioned, you want to share like what value you're going to be providing to that host's audience. Let them know. Don't just make it all about yourself. Don't make the pitch be like 3-4 paragraphs deep. The reason you don't want to do this is because the host is not going to have time to go through and read all of that. Maybe they will occasionally. So instead of putting all that, just putting everything in the pitch, that's where you could use a one sheet or a resume. And for those listening who don't know what that is, it's basically similar to like a media kit or a resume where you can send the podcast host. So like what we do for our clients is you would include the client's, let's say you include their full bio, where in the pitch you include more of a shortened version. So you'd include your full bio, you include what topics you love to talk about, what questions you would like to answer, just different things like that. So that way you're not putting it in the entire pitch. And then something that I found to be very successful and hosts absolutely love it is including a 5-star review on their podcast when you're sending out the pitch. And then you can just take a screenshot of it. I always like to include that in the pitch. It just goes that little bit of an extra mile. And then also with that said, I should have mentioned at the beginning of the pitch, just make it customized to that specific podcast host. Don't just make it cookie cutter. Make sure that you're checking out an episode that the host has done, checking out the show description, because you don't want to just be wasting all your time reaching out to shows that you're not a fit for. So I find that taking that extra time to pull out a tidbit of what you actually like about the show or why you think the show is a fit for yourself is going to go an extra mile. Because sometimes even for myself, when I'm sending out pitches, the name of the show, I'm like, oh, I'm a fit for it. And then I go read the description or I check out an episode. I'm like, well, this show is not going to have me on. I don't want to be wasting my time. So that's super important. And then for anyone out there that says, hey, I'm nervous about going on a podcast. I've never gone on a podcast before. It's sort of a strategy that I recommend. And I say it's like the piggyback method. So when you're first going out there and starting out, you probably want to go on your smaller shows. So there's tools that you can use. One's called Listen Notes. One's called Refana. They're basically monthly softwares that you can pay for. They're going to run you, I believe, about $150 each per month. Our companies use both of them. But the cool thing about them is you can filter for podcasts. Like let's say you wanted to go on entrepreneurship podcasts, you would just type in entrepreneurship, show you all the podcasts, and then you can filter by how many episodes that they have. So if you're just starting out, maybe you want to try to go on podcasts that have fewer than 10 episodes. Typically, these aren't going to be your bigger podcasts. That way you get to practice on those shows, which is nice. And then as you start to get more comfortable, you start to get your story down, maybe you go to those medium-sized shows, those podcasts that have 20 to 50 episodes. And then obviously from there, you go into your larger podcasts, your shows that have 50 or more episodes. I find that typically works great, especially for those who have never been on a podcast. You're unsure of how it's going to go. How's my microphone? How's the setup? And you're just all around nervous. And that's super normal for anyone that's never been on a podcast before. So that's typically a strategy that I recommend for folks as well. And obviously the last piece, just being consistent. If you're looking to be a guest on podcasts, you have your own one sheet, you have your own pitch, and you're reaching out to shows, you just want to be consistent. I know for me, I like to reach out to about 3 to 5 new shows per day and then just be very consistent with that. Some weeks I might get 10 bookings out of that for myself. Some weeks I might get 5 bookings out of that. It's ups and downs, but that way I know I'm being very consistent with it. So I'm not just going on interviews once and then a couple months go by, then I'm not doing any interviews and then I'm picking it back up. So you have this big ebb and flow where you'd rather just have it be consistent. That's another really good piece of advice I like to give, whether it's myself, whether it's our clients or anyone listening to the podcast.
Yeah, wow, that is huge in that you send out pitches daily to several shows. And that's how you get booked so much. And that's an amazing visibility and marketing strategy in reaching several different audiences instead of depending only on your social media. Because that was the other thing I was going to ask you. Lots of my clients, when I say you need to get on podcasts, they're like, I don't even listen to podcasts. How am I going to pitch? And I'm like, it doesn't matter. Obviously, listen to the ones that you're pitching to get a sense of like what you suggested. But I don't think people understand the power of the reach of a podcast. Mm-hmm. So I'd love for you to speak to that. And the other thing, when you're talking about consistency, is I'd love to hear what your strategy is for following up. Because many times when you're pitching, you may not hear right away. So what do you recommend that?
Yeah, most certainly. I would say of the first one, the power of the podcast and the reach of them. Let's say you, as the host, any host out there, they've spent time building up a following. Your audience is probably listening to you because they know, like, and trust you. You know, that good aspect of it. Now I'm coming onto the podcast. Maybe they never heard of me. Maybe they never heard of my company, but they are building that trust with me because you're having me on your show. So you're able to leverage other hosts' audience instead of you going out there necessarily having to build your own audience from scratch, which is really nice. And then 2, typically most interviews, you're able to go through and potentially get the video recording of it. And then you can create tons of social media content on it. And what's nice about the podcast is you're creating video content. You're not just sitting down to write social media posts, say on like LinkedIn. You have the nice video content. It's typically, I find, easier to build out and to share. And then I would say the other part of the question, when it comes to following up, I typically have myself and my team or anyone out there, we usually follow up about a week after I done that initial outreach, and just something simple like, hey, host name, just checking in, just wanted to see if you'd like to have me as a guest on your show. And then I sort of just leave it at that. And I've seen in the past where sometimes folks might follow up like 4 or 5 times. And at that point, it can just be annoying to the host and you don't want to get that reputation. So I find following up once and then potentially doing it again another 2 or 3 weeks out if you so choose to do. But I can't tell you how many number of times where I'll reach out to say 25 shows in a week. I'll hear back from 5 of them. I'll follow up. And the next thing I know, I hear back from 7 or 8 more of them. So you're just super powerful. And it's crazy how many times you'll hear people say, oh, I wanted to have you on the show. I just been meaning to get back to your email. Thanks for giving me that extra nudge. And then it's also nice on the back end if they say, hey, I'm just booked out. I just don't think it's a fit for what I'm looking to talk about. At least you have your answer. And so I'd rather know one way or another. But yeah, it's definitely super powerful to make sure that you're following up. I say at least give it a week. Don't want to be honing in on them a day or two after you send the pitch. But again, just being consistent. So what I typically do is I'll reach out to all the podcasts in a given week. So let's say I'm reaching out Monday through Friday. The following Friday, that's when I'll do my follow-up for the previous week. And I just be consistent. That's my day that I'm going to follow up with all the podcasts. And I find that having that set schedule just keeps me on top of it so I don't fall behind, because the last thing you want to do is be sending 50 or 75 follow-up emails to podcasts and you're spending your whole Friday just doing busy work than anything that's going to help you be productive.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's super helpful. I love that. And with all of that work, that's why you would hire someone like your company to help entrepreneurs conduct, especially as they're starting out. They can definitely get organized and send a couple a day or create a strategy for themselves of a few a week. But if you're really wanting to get serious, outsourcing that process can be very beneficial. What is the onboarding process that you have when people are like, all right, I want to work with you? And I know you said you're expanding beyond investing right now. So if any of our listeners, investing or not, are interested, tell us more about what it looks like to work with Podcasting You.
So what we do is we have our clients fill out a client intake form. So this will go into who your target audience is, your background, your bio, what questions you want to talk about. And I find that having the clients create that themselves rather than us creating it, because if we create it for the client, they'll be like, yes, that looks good. So we want them to go in and put the time in on their end. So then our team will take that and then we'll basically go out and create the one sheet, like I mentioned for the client that I mentioned previously. So we'll create that for the client. And then we'll create a database of shows for the client. So we get their approval on every show that we're reaching out to. And we find that this remedies the situation where we reach out to a podcast and the client says yes, or the client is like, actually, I don't want to go on that show. Sometimes the client may say yes to a show and then they say, no, I don't want to be on that show. Just can be like an awkward situation from time to time. So we just want to make sure we're remedying that situation by getting the client's approval on all shows that we're reaching out to. And then from there, I just starting that process of reaching out to shows. Ideally, when someone fills out that client intake form, we like to get all their materials back to them within 3 days. Once we get their approval from there, we like to get them booked on their first show within 5 days. So we like to move rather quickly because we know within the podcasting space that sometimes when you are getting booked on these interviews, you might be scheduling the interview a week or two out. Then once the interview is a week or two out, then all of a sudden the host might have a backfill of episodes where your episode might not get published for, say, potentially 6 to 8 weeks later. So now you're looking at anywhere from, say, 8 to 10 weeks from the time you start with us. So that can be a long timeline. So the quicker that we can get you booked on those podcasts, the shorter time frame, and then you start to see your return on investment. You don't want to work with our company, pay us for 4 months, and then not have a single interview go live and be like, hey, what's going on? We really like to just move quickly. And I think it's helpful. We're a small team. It's myself and 4 other employees that I have. And we just like to be nimble and just move rather quickly to make sure we can get that done at a fast pace.
Yeah, that's great. Speaking of return of investment, I'd love to hear some success stories, because I know on my end, whenever I book a cool guest that I've been wanting to, it's such a celebration period with me and my team. And also when I get booked on big podcasts as well, it's always fun. So what are some of your favorite stories with clients that got booked on shows that you're able to reach out, that they would, large audiences, and also a return for them in terms of sales or whatever that they notice as a result of being on a show?
One of our clients, by going out there and getting booked on podcasts, he was able to raise additional investor capital. So he brought in 25 new investors to his company, and he had in the minimum investments $50K. He didn't tell me exactly how much, but I know just doing the quick math, that's at least $1 million. We helped his company raise. So that was pretty cool. We helped another guy grow. He was going on podcasts and he took the podcast interviews and created social media content for it. And I think when he was working with us, he was pretty successful to begin with. He had a couple 100,000 followers, but now he was able to grow his brand to over 1 million followers on Instagram. He's like an Airbnb coach, which was pretty cool. Outside of that, or not outside of that, we've obviously worked with a lot of clients. I'm trying to think of some of the other cool clients that we worked with. Just, at the end of the day, it's just growing these investor leads for our clients, getting them more leads for their business. Those are typically our success stories. One was cool, working with a company called Yield Street to help grow their own podcast by getting them guests for their show, which was pretty cool because they're a pretty big company. That was probably our biggest client that we work with today, because a lot of our clients, they're smaller investors. And I say smaller, teams of 10 to 20 employees, where Yield Street, they might have a couple hundred of employees, which was pretty cool. And I'd say outside of that, we worked with one. And then within the real estate space, you have someone called Robert Kiyosaki. So he wrote the book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. So we had one of his legal advisors as a client of ours, Garrett Sutton.
Wow.
And I think he renewed his package like 2 or 3 times with us. So that was super excited to work with him. And it was very easy to book. It was like a 99% success rate when it came to booking him. But yeah, no, it's cool, all the different stories we work with and all the different clients that we work with. But yeah, at the end of the day, the reason the clients hire us is to help them grow their business, build brand awareness. And it's been a good journey so far.
That's so exciting. Congratulations on all of that. So there is the other side. If there is somebody that has a show and wants help in finding guests, obviously specific higher end guests, you can help them too.
Yeah, that's something that we definitely offer as well. It was funny. That's how I got my start in the podcasting space per se. I was doing my own show and I was booking my own guests. And then within Podcasting You, I didn't offer as a service for the first couple of years, just because I was just so focused on booking clients on podcasts. And then we found that a lot of our clients had podcasts themselves and came to us and be like, you're booking me on shows. Can you also book guests for my own show? I was like, sure. And then eventually, enough people asked. I was like, okay, I got to add it as a service on our podcast. So we have a handful of clients right now that every single month, we just help them book guests for their podcast. So that's definitely a service that we can do. And we try to find those unique out of the box guests, where folks who are successful, but aren't necessarily doing like a podcast tour per se, or going on every single podcast out there. And they've sort of going to have that recycled story. So we look at like best-selling authors on Amazon, folks that maybe have written a really cool book, but have never been on a podcast or have been on very few podcasts. We look at professors in college. A lot of times they've written pretty cool studies. So we just try to bring on those type of unique guests onto our client shows, where maybe not too many people have heard of them, but again, they have a really cool background and story.
Cool. Well, this is so good. Thank you so much for sharing the tips, because this is really valuable. I mean, people can listen to this and run with that, with all the ideas that you gave, and in terms of following up and all of that. And they can also check you out and check out the services. How can we find more information about Podcasting You and connect?
Certainly. So one, they can just go to our website, podcastingyou.com. So it's just podcastingyou.com, or they can feel free to just connect with me on LinkedIn, Trevor Oldham. Happy to connect there and happy to chat with anyone there as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Trevor. This is so fun.